Hi, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting Group. I wanted to share with you today the results of our 2019 ERP report, which we published a few weeks ago, and are just now putting out some additional highlights and summary findings from that report. And before I get started, just a quick overview of Third Stage. We're an independent, technology agnostic digital consulting firm, so we don't represent any of the software vendors or system integrators that are represented here in the study. So the 2019 ERP report is intended to be a very agnostic view of what's going on in the marketplace and looking at some qualitative and quantitative findings of our study that we conduct each year of ERP implementations across the globe. Now, when we look at the purpose of the 2019 report, we're looking for quantitative and qualitative data from recent transformations. We actually went back several years looking at different digital transformations and ERP projects that we've been involved with, but we focused primarily on ERP implementations that had been completed in the last 2 years. And one of the interesting things about this year's study compared to past studies that we've been involved with is that we are looking more at statistical correlation. So in other words, we all have our gut instincts and experience bases that suggest what might result in success or failure. But this year, in this year's study, we actually look at some of the data, some of the quantitative data to look at those correlations to see what is it that's driving the overall success of some of these projects. We look at trends compared to implementations of years past, as well as lessons and recommendations to CXOs, whether that be CIOs, CHROs, COOs, CFOs, whatever the executive choice might be. And also anyone involved in digital transformation and ERP projects will find this information useful. And by the way, you can download the complete report on our website. There's also a link included in the YouTube channel or the YouTube page below. And I'm going to share with you just a few of the highlights here today very quickly, but there's a lot more detail in the report that you'll see when you download it. So the first thing is implementation duration. When we look at the average ERP implementation, how long does it take and how much does it cost? That's one of the big things that a lot of companies will ask us. And so when we look at mid-sized companies, the average duration is anywhere from 14 to 16 months. And the reason we provide a range here is because that is the biggest cluster of responses that we got for companies in that mid-market that are between 50 million and 1 billion in annual revenue. The overwhelming majority of them were completing their ERP implementation somewhere between 14 to 16 months. For larger companies, over $1 billion in revenue, which is a very broad range, obviously, that could be just a couple billion to 100 billion plus. But in general, for those companies implementing ERP systems, the average was close to 3 years, between 31 and 34 months. Now, when we look at total cost, expressed as a percentage of annual revenue, which is the way we like to look at it, because the raw dollar figure of how much money companies are spending on their complete implementation is going to vary up and down year to year based on the size of the company. So the bigger companies are going to spend more dollars, which is going to skew the averages. So what we do is we normalize that data and look at the numbers expressed as a percentage of the company's annual revenue. So when we look at mid-sized companies that are under $1 billion in revenue, again, in that 50 million to $1 billion range, their average implementation cost is going to end up being somewhere between 3 and 5% on average of their annual cost, or their annual revenue, I should say. So that total cost of ownership of 3 to 5% of their annual revenue is spread out over the 14 to 16 months on average that companies are spending as far as duration. Now, when we look at larger companies that are over $1 billion in revenue, their number is lower when expressed as a percentage of annual revenue, more in the 2 to 3% range. And the reason for that is because these bigger companies just have more scale. They have more economies of scale. There's a certain amount of activities that you have to do and a certain amount of money you need to invest in software and more importantly, the implementation activities, whether you're a $100 million company or a $50 billion company, there's a certain amount of minimum that you're going to have to spend. So those larger companies are able to spread those costs out over larger scale, which is why that number is lower. So again, on average, the bigger companies are spending between 2 and 3% of their annual revenue on the total cost of ownership. And that total cost of ownership, by the way, includes software licenses, implementation cost, any sort of outside consulting costs, any sort of additional technologies that are needed to enable the ERP software, as well as data migration. So when we look at operational disruption, that's a big risk, kind of looking at the darker side or the potential dark side of ERP projects. Too often companies experience that operational disruption, which typically are things like not being able to ship product, not being able to close the books, for example. What we don't assume is that call it the minor operational disruption that comes with any ERP project, the things like struggling to learn a new system or having to retrain some employees to make sure everyone's on track. We would consider that sort of normal disruption during an ERP implementation. But when we talk about material operational disruption, we're talking about major things like not being able to ship the books, not being able to pay people, that sort of thing. So what we found is that 51 to 54% of companies experience that operational disruption, depending on which data set we're looking at. When we slice and dice the data by company size or industry vertical, software being implemented, whatever the case may be, regardless of how we slice and dice that data, the number tends to be very consistent between 51 and 54%. And of those companies that experience that operational disruption, they're experiencing an average cost increase of anywhere from 50 to 300% of their initial investment in the ERP implementation. So in other words, they may have spent, call it $10 million on their ERP implementation, but the ones that had the operational disruption could have anywhere from $5 million to $30 million of additional cost that were caused by the material operational disruption. So the lesson here for CIOs and people about to embark on ERP implementations is to really recognize that there are hidden costs there that are very real that will transpire if we don't do the implementation right. So if we're looking to save a lot of cost up front during the implementation, we have to make sure we're not doing it at the expense of increasing the cost longer term post-implementation, which is where a lot of companies get into trouble. And quite frankly, that's where a lot of companies end up in lawsuits and end up hiring us to be expert witness in those lawsuits, which we don't want any of you to ever have to do. So when we look at the variables with the strongest impact on operational disruption, the ones that have the least amount of disruption, or the ones that are least likely to have operational disruption, are the ones that have clearly defined business processes. They have invested in organizational change and training. They have executive alignment among the key stakeholders in the transformation team. So in other words, the strategic objectives of the company are aligned with the overall ERP project and vice versa. And also there's time and effort spent during user acceptance and conference room pilots. So the companies that do those four things, those are the things that had the four things that had the biggest impact, positive or negative, on operational disruption. And so finally, the last thing I'll share from this study, and again, there's a lot more detail, a lot of stuff I'm not covering in that report that you'll see when you download the report. We also look at the top challenges of digital transformation. So the things that companies are having trouble with during their ERP projects. Number one on the list is organizational change and anything to do with the people side of the transformation. That is the number one difficulty cited by a majority of organizations that have gone through these sort of ERP projects. The second biggest thing is the transformation is misaligned with the strategic objectives of the company. So our corporate strategy is to scale and to standardize our business processes and to build shared services models, but then our ERP project goes off in a different direction and lets people customize and gets a lot of resistance to change. So we end up tailoring the system for all the different locations to where we're back to where we started, which is we're not at all standardized. We're not building something that can scale for growth. So that's an example of how companies get misaligned between their strategic objectives and the ERP implementation itself. The number three challenge is difficulty managing or addressing deficiencies with the system integrator. So in other words, the system integrators are running the project for you. You don't have transparency into it. You're not addressing the things they're not good at, and there's no accountability. So really making sure you manage those system integrators, have the right project governance in place. You drive them, you manage them rather than them managing you. That's extremely important. That's a phenomenon that we see very often with companies that get into this learned helplessness of just relying too much on the system integrator when the system integrator is not, in fact, the answer for all of your needs as it relates to an ERP implementation. And then the fourth thing is clarity of business processes. The companies that spend time up front before they ever bring on that army of consultants from the system integrator are going to be much more successful. They're going to have better governance over the project in the system integrator. There's going to be more clarity around how to deploy the technology because now you've got clarity on what you want to be when you grow up. So the companies that take the time to build a business blueprint, a real business blueprint before ever engaging with the system integrator, those companies are going to be a lot more successful. They're going to spend a lot less time and money and expose themselves to a lot less risk than companies that don't do that. And then number 5 is data migration. Companies tend to struggle with this, especially in the day and age of predictive analytics and machine learning and artificial intelligence. Data is only going to continue to become more and more important, and it's probably going to continue to become more and more challenging for organizations. So companies that have gone through ERP implementations in recent years continue to struggle with data migration. So that's a quick overview of our 2019 ERP report. I encourage you to reach out and contact us. You can download the report by looking at the bottom of your screen or in the YouTube channel. We've got a link to that. You can also go to thirdstage-consulting.com. Also encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel here, to my YouTube channel, to get more content like this. Hope this is helpful and hope you all have a great day and look forward to speaking with you soon. Take care.